Good morning. Good morning to everyone. My name is Linnanne Polite, and I'm the gallery director here at Vashon Center for the Arts. So I want to welcome you all today for another great, fabulous, wonderful, can I say any more adjectives, for Rebecca's talks. A couple things. First of all, and very important, we want to thank our sponsors for our talks on the rock, and that's Tom and Ida Gay Nicolino. I'm tongue-tied this morning. Nicolino. Yeah, thank you. Somehow I always like moving syllables around. And also Ellen Kritzman. So I want to thank them. Let's make a pod. Yes. They really make these possible, and so we're really grateful. We don't have our students today. Sometimes we have them, from Harbor School, but it's the last week of school, so they didn't make it today. Also, all of you are botanical lovers, so be sure to know about our garden tour. We have some amazing stops along the way. It's the 17th to 18th of June, and we have tickets still available. You can get those at the front desk. So without anything else, we'll move on to Rebecca.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. This was supposed to be the very last in this year's series of introductions. The weather and COVID gods had other ideas, so we will be finishing the introductions over the summer. But this was going to, this series was going to culminate in Rory McEwen just in time for the Vashon Garden Tour, who is probably the most revered botanical artist of the 20th century. And this series involves me introducing you to lesser known but great artists. But I had to be introduced to Rory McEwen by a Vashoner. I had never heard of him myself before Jean Emmons pressed this catalog into my hands a few years ago and said that she hoped that someday I would do a lecture on him here on Vashon. And so here I am, and that being said, I am not an expert on botanical art. Perhaps because in my many years of undergraduate and graduate art history classes, I did not see a single work of botanical art. It is considered a stepsister to the field of art history. And if there is any artist who can convince the art world with its curators and its taste makers and powers that be, that botanical art is not mere rote description of objects in the natural world, but an authentic, modern expression of self, that artist would have to be Rory McEwen. Now, as you may have noticed, McEwen was easy on the eyes, and he was gifted in so many ways. The very first art historian, Giorgio Vasari, tells us about Raphael, that Raphael was supremely gifted by the gods, by the fates, with his looks, his grace, his elegance, his charm, and his abilities in multiple areas of the arts. One could say the exact same thing about Rory McEwen. He was not like you and me. For one thing, he was the middle child of 7. And while some of you may have grown up in large families, you probably did not grow up here. Rory McEwen was to the manor born. Marchmont House in Berwickshire, in the Scottish borders area of Scotland, so between Edinburgh and Hadrian's Wall, was his childhood home. So he grew up hunting and fishing and rambling in the countryside around this house, this estate. He liked to say, not entirely facetiously, that he was brought up in the 18th century. And this is the interior of the home. And so he had this very traditional, aristocratic, rural British upbringing, and it was one of his governesses, a French governess, who when he was the age of 8, encouraged him to make his first flower painting. But he also had an eldest brother, also a very fine painter, who was obsessed with American Southern music, rhythm and blues, gospel, jazz. He idolized figures like Leadbelly and Robert Johnson, the early blues singers, who in the 1940s were very obscure. So it's this mix of this 18th century upbringing and this interest in American black music from his brother. His great-great-grandfather was the English botanist John Lindley, who had none of his great-great-grandson's talent as an illustrator, as you can see here. He was fairly pedestrian, but this interest in botany did run in the family. Lindley was responsible for saving Kew Gardens back in the 1820s. And so when Rory McEwen was 11, he went up to Eton, as one did, for his education. Now, he never went to art school. He did not have any kind of traditional artistic education, but the arts master at Eton was Wilfrid Blunt, who was both an artist and an art historian, and who called McEwen the most talented pupil to ever pass between his hands. Now, in those years, Blunt was working on this study, The Art of Botanical Illustration, which was published in 1950, the year that Rory McEwen graduated from Eton. But McEwen did not go straight to university. Instead, he served 2 years in the military, in the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders. After which, in 1952, the day, well, as he put it, quote, "The day I got out of the army, I sat down and painted a rose. And I found to my surprise that my hand had unknowingly educated itself, that I had developed an appetite, could even see a short way ahead," end quote. So it was not this rose. This is from about a year later. I don't have the exact rose he painted that day, but I think it's really important to underscore that when he wished to come home to himself, his most authentic way of doing that was sitting down and painting a rose. It was something that he would turn to time and time again in his life. So in 1952, at the age of 20, he began studying at Cambridge. His degree was in English, but he became very involved in the music scene there. He was part of the Cambridge Footlights, which was the annual sort of Follies production. He wrote and performed in the 1955 production at the Scala Theatre in London of this Cambridge Footlights. And one reviewer said that it was better than anything that was on the East End at that moment. But he was still painting roses when he had the time. So this is his beautiful Rosamundi rose from his second year at Cambridge. watercolor on vellum was his technique, and he decided that whenever possible, he would paint on vellum, which was something that was developed to spare painting on ivory, actually, and gives the luminosity of this technique of McEwen's art such a unique experience. So Rosamundi, and this is a detail because the whole amount of the negative space would not fit on my scanner. So imagine it fits a bit more broadly on the space, and it's a shame because McEwen's placement of his objects in that negative space is so precise and so very beautiful. But it was in about this time, 1953, that his brother-in-law acquired a set of original watercolors of roses by Pierre-Joseph Redoute, who was a protege of Marie Antoinette, but originally painted these roses that came into the family for Empress Josephine Bonaparte. So Rory had the opportunity to study these early 19th century watercolor on vellum roses that are now very famous, greeting cards galore, but at the time were much less well known than they are now. And Redoute would always be McEwen's model for elegance and purity. And we can see him looking at Redoute throughout his career. This is a much later rose painted from near the end of his life. While he was at Cambridge, McEwen was commissioned to illustrate a book on old carnations and pinks, heritage English botanicals. He provided 17 illustrations for this book. And you can see one there on the right as it appears in the pages, but this is one of the very beautiful illustrations that he made for this book, Old Irish Laced Pink, with its 4 blossoms and 3 buds from 2 crossed stems. So for this project, he would have returned to the Royal Library at Windsor, which he first visited as a student of Wilfrid Blunt at Eton, to look at examples like this 17th century British botanical artist Alexander Marshall, how he handled carnations on this page. He would also have gone to the British Museum to look at works like this by Georg Ehret, a German 18th century botanical artist. And actually, McEwen claimed that he did not much admire Ehret's work, that he found it a little heavy, a little coarser than his own preferred treatment, although it's hard not to see some of Ehret's compositions in works like McEwen's carnations Hawkshead Flake and Nuki Flake, with their crossed stems, the paler one on the right, the redder one on the left, in this almost heraldic image of these 2 carnations. Another one from the book was Carnation Old Flame. And McEwen gives us 2 stems of the same variety, the sort of black striped variety, but he uses the name of these carnations, old flame, to infuse the work with some meaning. So we get the sense of these carnations as individuals, as perhaps, the one on the right, turning away a bit. This one perhaps curious or leaning in towards an old flame. So there is meaning, there is emotion, even in these works of incredible observation. The next project for which he was commissioned was of Old English tulips. Various varieties. This is his very daring composition of the Julia Farnese tulip, where it is the specimen in the back that dramatically comes forward, curving around, and the one that begins in the front ends up there in the rear, so that we get the tulip as it's beginning to open, as well as when it is somewhat more closed. We get something of the growth habit, the leaves here, things that we'll see later in his career he would omit entirely. This is a single bloom from that project, the Old English tulip, Lord Frederick Cavendish, with its, its gorgeous red flame stripes on that yellow ground. But painting tulips was not the only thing that McEwen was doing at this time. He and his brother were getting more and more interested in music. So after he graduated from Cambridge in 1956, Rory and Alexander, Alec McEwen, went to America with their guitars. And they traveled all over the United States performing Scottish folk music. So this was at the beginning of the folk music revival in England and then in the United States as well. And they recorded this volume of Scottish songs and ballads for Smithsonian Folkways collection. And so they went to New York City and they looked up the widow of Leadbelly, Huddie Ledbetter, and he had died a few years earlier, and they were afraid that Martha Ledbetter might be offended by these two young Scottish aristocrats coming to her and playing the music of her husband. But when they played a Leadbelly song for her, they said she just lit up, and she went into her bedroom and pulled out from under the bed Leadbelly's legendary 12-string guitar. And she let Rory play it. And this was something that was like a dream for him, to get to touch Leadbelly's guitar, to play it. And so he would embark on a search throughout the American South for a 12-string guitar to purchase. Meanwhile, his brother stayed in New York City and took blues guitar lessons with a blind preacher. So both of them were attempting to really steep themselves in American blues. And Rory finally found a 12-string guitar in Galveston, Texas, to buy. He and his brother enrolled in the Musicians Union in Kansas City so that they could perform there. And when they returned, so they spent more than a year in the United States, sort of crisscrossing the South. They got all the way to California, recording and playing and listening. And when they got back to England, they recorded a series of albums that they called Hootenanny of folk music, Scottish folk music, music that they themselves wrote in a folk idiom. So they are writing, they are performing, and Rory even gets a television gig in these years. He becomes a celebrity in the British music scene. Is he still painting flowers? Well, the dates on this work are expressive of the amount of time he had in these years to work on this part of his life. He began this James Wilde, Sir Joseph Paxson, and Adonis tulips with Narcissus in 1955, before he left for the United States. He finished it in 1962. But he was still interested in doing this work. He said these were all from the Wakefield Tulip Growers Association, which he would have a very close associationship with. And he was hired in 1963 to illustrate another book of British botanicals, this time auricula species. These are not as varied as some of his other works, as the tulips and the carnations were. The editors wanted the entire plant of each species depicted, including the root structure, which McEwen has some fun with, creating these almost calligraphic curves of the roots of this Auricula S.G. Holden and others, but he doesn't have as much leeway compositionally on these works as he did on some of his other projects. But he is painting these auriculas at the same time that he was hosting the variety show Hullabaloo, which aired for several years. It was like, well, imagine it was like Prairie Home Companion, but on TV. And McEwen played his guitar, he played his 12-string, he invited important folk artists, not just black blues singers, but Peter, Paul, and Mary appeared on Hullabaloo and so forth. And he had his own band, and he would make up calypso verses on current events. Like the audience could throw him, the latest scandal from the House of Lords, and he would create a little song about it. So he was a celebrity. He was famous in England as a musician and a presenter of this variety show. And he made the very difficult decision in 1964 to leave the show to focus on his botanical art. So he painted these anemones. And oh, I thought I had another one, but apparently I do not. He painted these anemones in that period where he's deciding if he wants to continue in the music world or to devote himself to flower illustration. And his niece describes these anemones as like long-legged young women strutting around in miniskirts. And this is swinging London. This is the London where Mary Quant is inventing the miniskirt. So there is this modern quality to McEwen's depictions. This one is from that same period, 63, 64, when he's still hosting Hullabaloo, but wanting to go back to the botanical illustration that he feels is his true calling. And the composition of this dead carnation is particularly beautiful in the way that it swirls around the edges of the work. But the center is a void, where we expect to see the object. Instead, we see negative space. And despite the fact that he is using this very expensive material, McEwen was not afraid to leave lots of negative space to really give his botanical objects room to spread out. Now, this carnation is not in the peak of health, and it reminds us, it joins some other stems where there are buds, carnations that have not yet had the chance to bloom and die, but it reminds us that every cut flower is dying. Every uncut flower is dying. Every living thing is dying. That fragility, that evanescence is what gives it its beauty and its meaning in the present moment. So McEwen decided to devote himself entirely to illustration. And in 1965, the year after ending Hullabaloo, he painted this fritillary crown imperial. It's one of his largest works, this majestic botanical that appears in a lot of the more overblown, the more exuberant 17th century Dutch flower painting. You'll see a crown imperial at the very top, but this one is not just peeking out from a bouquet of tulips and peonies and narcissi. It is alone there on this very large page, and we get this strong sense of its presence. It almost seems to have, a headdress there and a body and a neck, again with that anthropomorphism. However, in 1965, Rory McEwen was also having second thoughts about this particular career route because he had become part of the contemporary art scene in London. In 1965, he met the American artist Jim Dine, who's often called a pop artist, but he himself chafed against that label. He made this, he exhibited this walking dream with 4-foot clamp in London, and it was snapped up by the Tate. And he and McEwen became very close friends. In fact, Jim Dine said that he felt somewhat guilty that he was gaining a reputation, that he was a much talked about artist doing work like this, when his friend, who was capable of making an object like this crown imperial fritillary, was not appreciated by the art world. And McEwen, on the other hand, was feeling like a relic when he was painting something like this, feeling like an antiquarian, creating an object that belonged in an earlier century, in this era of swinging London with its miniskirts and its pop art and so forth. So the two of them became very close friends. They even recorded an album together of songs and poems, but that included 2 screen prints, one by each artist. Jim Dine, of course, contributed the one on the upper right with his familiar heart motif. But the one on the upper left is Rory McEwen's contribution. So his screen print is minimalist. It's modern. It is abstract. It has virtually nothing in common except for perhaps a sensitivity to color with his botanical art. And in these years, McEwen was a good friend of R.B. Cottage and David Hockney. In fact, he owned this work. Well, I forgot to mention that he was married in 1958. So in that, in that period when that 3 tulips and a narcissus went unfinished, he was not only traveling around America and developing a variety show, but he was establishing himself as a husband and a father. He married an American debutante. She was the granddaughter of John Jacob Astor, who died on the Titanic. So they had a little extra cash to buy things like Hockney paintings. And they had 4 children by this time. And so this is a painting that they owned. And for an artist who described himself as being brought up in the 18th century, it is a particularly appropriate one because this is Hockney's modern reworking of a Rococo painting by Francois Boucher. So this is the kind of art that the McEwens were surrounding themselves with in these years, and Rory began to make minimalist sculptures out of polarized glass and perspex, which is the British trade name for plexiglass. So these are installation photographs of his 1968 show at the Richard DeMarco Gallery in Edinburgh. And there is not a pink or a crown fritillary to be seen. There's the color pink, but these are minimalist, hard-edged works that are completely different from his botanical works, but that he felt were more appropriate to their time. He also got involved with the Edinburgh Festival, and he and his brother had performed in a number of Edinburgh festivals. But in the 1971, the artist Joseph Beuys was the revered guest. And so Rory McEwen is here in his 3-piece suit with his gallery owner and a couple of the organizers of the festival, and Beuys himself, the internationally recognized conceptual artist, on Ranach Moor, recording what Beuys would call his Scottish symphony. So he's very, very involved in the contemporary cutting-edge art world of conceptual art, of minimalist art. And he's also still very involved in the music world. So if you went to a party at the McEwen home in London, you might rub elbows with Princess Margaret and John Lennon. You never knew which of the Beatles was going to be there. If you ever wondered who introduced George Harrison to Ravi Shankar, that was Rory McEwen. And in fact, he would follow Ravi Shankar back to India and paint an Indian onion in Benares. So he is still making, alongside those polarized glass and perspex sculptures, he's still making his botanical art. And look at the colors in that, that sculpture, that standing work on the left. They are not, can you see that they're standing on the floor and illuminated from below? They're not hung on the walls. Look at the colors and then look at the Indian onion. And you can see that he's still interested in that same array of colors. One scholar has written that no one but Rory McEwen could imbue an onion with the whole world. And he does here. It is, of course, an imperfect onion, like all onions are, and it has those dried outer layers, and we see some of the roots as well, but we get the sense of pulsating life underneath those layers, that if we just pulled back, and we almost feel like we could pull back those layers, that we could get at the more brilliant purples and magentas that are there underneath. He painted this red pepper that I find a hard time seeing as not anthropomorphic. For me, this is, it's a reclining nude of a pepper. Or even it's a reclining couple embracing of a pepper. Its puckered skin suggests human skin or bed sheets. Maybe I'm just seeing too much into this, but it's an extraordinary pepper, and it has almost that sense of hyper reality that the photorealist artists, Richard Estes and the like, were imbuing their paintings with in just exactly these years. And this work has a stronger light than this work or any of his earlier work, and that's something that he will continue to experiment with in his work. So in the next couple of years, he did a series he called True Facts from Nature. And these involve objects from the natural world that he lines up visually on his vellum. But we don't know if he's respecting their actual scale or not. And it's very clear that these did not just fall this way, that he has very deliberately arranged them, given them exactly this much negative space. There are dried leaves. This, I think, is a hazelnut at the lower right. That object right there. This is a fragment of this very dead and dried up leaf. And this is a painting that no one would mistake for a redoute. These are works that could not have been made in any century but the 20th. They are informed by minimalism. They are informed by modern design. This one, number 10, was a gift for McEwen's friend Cy Twombly, the abstract painter who's known for his looping lines and that dried grass there at the left that makes this sort of zigzagging movement back and forth, could almost be the lines in a Twombly painting. But then we get this helicopter seed pod right next to a much larger half of one. Is it a different species that happens to be much larger, or is he playing with the scale? It's hard to say. They've been described by one scholar as impenetrable, as if they had miraculously appeared with no hint as to how they were created. Now, scholars believe that McEwen's real breakthrough in his art came in the middle of the 1970s when he adopted a much stronger light. So you will have noticed that in keeping with the conventions of botanical painting, there are no surfaces depicted in any of McEwen's work. There are no shadows cast by these leaves or by this rose. There are shadows that the leaves create on one another, but there's not a shadow on the vellum, as it were. And this one, this beautiful Madame Isaac Herrera rose from 71-72, which sort of shares that composition of the dead carnation of swirling from lower right around to upper right. This is lit very evenly. In the middle of the decade, he will begin to use a much stronger light so that we get stronger shadows cast by some of the leaves on the others. We get stronger shadows amidst the depths of those petals. And if we look at a close-up, and is this not just absolutely breathtaking? If we look at a close-up, we can see that some of the leaves are almost washed out by that stronger light. Others are left in almost complete shadow. Others are, beautifully picked out by that strong light so that we see their texture. We see every hair on the stem of this rose, every hair on the bud, every whorl of the petals in this gorgeous rose. So this is his mature work. And again, it has that sense of almost hyper-realism to it. So if we look at his tulips, this one from 1974, the Columbine Beblumen feather, is lit with that more even light, whereas this one from just a year later, that again would not fit entirely on my scanner, so imagine a little more negative space, but this one is lit with that stronger light so that we get the sheen of the edges of the petals. And there is an almost metallic looking finish to this tulip. In 1976, he painted this dying tulip. And it should be mentioned that the McEwen family had had a number of tragedies in the 1970s. His eldest brother, who had for years battled depression and alcoholism, died in 1971. A younger brother died in 1976. So it may be that brother's death that this dying tulip is grappling with. But it is a beautiful work that almost seems to be dancing, to be in centrifugal motion. It's just lovely, and it shows another stage of life of this tulip, a very different stage of life that also shows the inner workings that we do not see in Helen Josephine, which is so closed and perfect. McEwen became so involved with the Wakefield Tulip Society that they named a tulip after him. So this is a photograph of an overblown specimen of the Rory McEwen Beblumen Flame tulip with those stripe patterns that he so loved to paint. He was still making his tabletop sculptures, like this perspex prismatic box in the 1970s. These hard-edged minimalist works using space-age materials like plexiglass that he felt were as central to his artistic identity, or nearly so, and were his bid for modernity that share with the tulips perhaps just, again, that subtle range of color. But he was also, in the later 70s, experimenting with a looser watercolor technique, a more traditional watercolor on paper technique in works like these wildflowers. And he even did a series of paintings of a single clump of grass, of weeds and grass, again and again and again. But he said it was very challenging for him, this conglomeration of different species, when he was so used to focusing on a single one. But these works have been likened to Albrecht Dürer's great piece of turf, where yes, we see dandelions and other recognizable species, but it is the whole that strikes us, as it is the whole in McEwen's wildflowers. This is, in a way, his updating of Dürer, of that watercolor tradition. He was hired in the late 1970s for yet another book of botanical specimens, this one, Fritillaria. And unfortunately, this book was never published, but he produced a number of absolutely stunning Fritillaria specimens, like this Latiflora, with, again, that strong lighting and that that sense of three-dimensionality of the bulbous form of the flower. In 1979, however, McEwen was diagnosed with cancer and spent that summer in the hospital receiving chemotherapy treatment, receiving cancer treatment, surgery, the whole 9 yards. And so in the fall, in recovery, in remission, he felt a bit as if he had to make up for lost time, and was working at a tremendous rate on a new theme for him. We'd seen this already in some of those pieces of nature where they are arrayed across, but a single dried leaf. And he gets in close to the damage on these leaves. They have been eaten away by insects. They are autumn leaves, so they are dried up. They have bits and pieces, where maybe an insect has laid eggs on them, and they are scarred. And he did not title these with the name of the tree that the leaf came from, but rather with the name of the place where he collected each leaf. So this very red leaf from Redcliffe Square in London. This ginkgo leaf Again, imagine a more ample background. East 61st Street, New York, which was the address of the apartment that his wife Romana lived in, the apartment that he stayed in back in 1956 when he first visited the United States, visited New York. So there are these layers of personal meaning that attach to a work like East 61st Street, where we see that the bulk of this ginkgo leaf is dead. It has dried up. It is that tan color. Only a little bit retains the brilliant yellow of its fall coloring, and around the edges, the original green. But all of this is dead. And he would write, quote, "The international news gets worse and worse, and still I sit and paint leaves. I feel like those Chinese artists who, in ages of great barbarism and unrest, painted images and wrote poems in which metaphor described the tragic events around them, so that the message was passed on to later ages in a simple, cryptic fashion. A dying leaf should be able to carry the weight of the world," end quote. And some of his leaves are not just insect bitten and drying up, but damaged. A critic said some look like a truck had run over them. And we can see that in Drayton Gardens, especially if we look at a close-up and see that in addition to the holes in this leaf, the places where it is completely dried up, that there are places that are bent and creased and damaged, and that they turn red on this leaf, as if they are bloodied, like the red veins that persist of this leaf. In 1979, he painted this Richmond Hill oak leaf, and this is one of several in which he allows the edges to fade away into nothing, which he had not done in previous work. And sometimes they touch the edge of the vellum. They end up off the canvas, off of the medium. But these works are so incredibly moving when we think of this artist battling cancer and reckoning with his own mortality. Around 1981, he also did a series of collages in which he used photographs from a life of travel, from his childhood in some of them, from places that he had been, and incorporated them into compositions with his own watercolor painting. And he really felt like this was a way of using the experiences of a lifetime. As he put it, quote, "All the pleasure and happiness and sadness, all the weather, the nights and the days, the hours spent fishing and shooting, etc., etc., end quote. In 1981, he was informed that his cancer had returned and had metastasized. He painted this second red pepper, which is nowhere near as fleshly as the first one. This one is desiccated, dried up, perhaps more ready to use as a condiment, but no longer with that sense of life and flesh and fertility of his earlier one. He made this single wild rose. And this, again, has a sense of presence that is, it's almost hyper or surreal, almost hallucinogenic in its sense of an actual organism being there on this flat sheet of vellum. But he also made this single rose petal. And he chronicled his work in a diary. It's humbling. So he's making these in the fall of 1981. And we can see him working every day, starting in the morning, working for a few hours, taking a break for lunch, going back to work, sometimes until into the evening. For instance, on Monday, October 5th, he works until 7:45, but he finished that wild rose. He makes this little thumbnail of it, tallies up all of the time that is marked wild rose, wild rose, wild rose, and concludes that he spent 31 hours and 10 minutes on that wild rose. But remarkably, he spent only 6 hours and 40 minutes on this fritillary. And, you can see him also marking in current events, Sadat's shooting, Jacques Brel's death, and so forth. But 6 hours and 40 minutes, not for this exact one, but for a fritillary of this sort, it's extraordinary. He is working at such a rapid pace in this period, as if he is just impelled to keep on working. And these are remarkable works that have the iridescence of Tiffany glass or of a beetle. But eventually, in 81, he had another surgery. He went to Australia for some experimental treatments. He even, in 1981, traveled to Afghanistan to look at wild fritillary species there. But by 1982, his doctors told him that the cancer had metastasized to his brain. He had an inoperable brain tumor, and it was terminal. And so, as much as he could, he kept painting, and he wrote to a friend that the dried leaves were something that he felt he had to do, like a debt he had to pay or a task he had to complete. But by late summer, he had not only staggering headaches, but worse perhaps for an artist of his caliber, he was suffering from double vision from the brain tumor. And he was hospitalized in London, surrounded by machines and nurses and tubes and whatnot. And his friends would come, but it was untenable for him. And so he stole out of his hospital room one evening and took matters into his own hands. He threw himself under a train at Kensington Station. And his family, who knew how optimistic he had been throughout this entire process, and how generous and how social he was, they said they could only imagine what the torment was like for him to choose to end his life in that violent way. So his life was only 50 years. His career was a brief one, and yet he accomplished more in those 50 years than most of us dream of doing in 100. And his family gifted his unused materials, his vellum, to the Hunt Institute for Botanical Art, which awards periodically pieces of Rory McEwen vellum to deserving botanical artists. Jean Emmons has been one of their recipients. This is an image of Diane Sutherland's Fritillaria meleagris, one of McEwen's favorite themes, painted on Rory McEwen vellum, which must be an incredible sense of pressure to be working on such a hallowed object. The exhibition, Colors of Reality, in 2013 brought Rory McEwen's art to a new generation, which it continues to inspire. So it included not just his paintings, but his materials, his painter's apron, his paints, as you see there, and his absolutely astonishing technique continues to inspire, despite McEwen's own ambitions of being a different kind of artist. He always returned to the botanical, writing to a friend that, quote, "I return to my precise certainties of observed detail like a drunk to his bottle," end quote. But the results are intoxicating, and this is where Rory McEwen felt himself the most authentic. He managed to put all of the sorrows and joys, all of the promises and disappointments and flat-out tragedy of human existence into his stunning paintings of roses and spectacular horticultural specimens and humble weeds. He infused new energy into the tradition of botanical painting without subtracting any of its precision, any of its legacy. As an artist who was always respectful of history, Rory McEwen, who called himself raised in the 18th century, transformed his 18th century models into great works of not just modern botanical art, but modern art. Thank you. So are there questions or images you'd like a second look at?
And you can speak loudly, or I can give you a mic, either one.
I was too lazy to translate all of the centimeters into inches, but 28 centimeters is about 11 inches high. So they're not enormous. The largest one was 46-ish. So it's 30 inches, 32 maybe. That's big. That's a big, imposing work. But some of them are quite modest in their scale. So 27 inches, again, or 27 centimeters, again, about 11 inches wide. So this is about this size. And he wasn't doing, during his illness, he wasn't doing the scale of some of those earlier works. I think he was doing what he could. And I think they're absolutely remarkable. This is about this size as well. So, well, maybe 12, a little bigger, a little larger than a piece of paper, 12 by 10-ish. So that leaf, that rose petal, is much larger than a rose petal. It's you know, it's an object with some real presence. Oops, don't know how I did that. But yeah, they're in the scale of, you know, of this size to twice or three times that size at the most. So yes. I believe there is one right now that is being, I don't think it has opened yet. Sorry? In September. It's going to frickin' Florida. It would be worth traveling to Chicago for, I think. Not to Florida. So yes, there is continuing interest in his work. Absolutely. Yes.
He had wealth.
Yes.
Was his painting or his sculptures seen as being collectible? Did he gain any wealth from them or not?
That's a really good question. Did he gain any wealth from them? I doubt it. Did he need any wealth? I don't think that he did. But he did want to be taken seriously as a modern artist and not a dilettante. And he showed at a major modern gallery in Edinburgh. He showed in London. There was a show up at the time of his death. In New York City, in the Bronx. And apparently it was kind of like a shrine that his New York friends would visit to see it one more time and to know that there wasn't going to be any more produced. But I don't think he earned much of a living. I mean, obviously he was paid for the works that were commissioned for the books of various botanicals, but I don't think he earned a living from his botanical work. And I think that's something that's very hard to do. So, yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about vellum?
Vellum.
And how his stock of vellum that was passed on to others? Special.
So vellum is calf skin.
It is.
Yes.
Because there's a paper that you can buy.
No, it's called vellum, but it's not vellum. This is real vellum. It is calf skin that has been prepared with a gesso coating that's very, very fine, very, very white, very, very, very smooth. So imagine, coating and then sanding and coating and sanding to get this coating that is absolutely perfectly smooth. And it takes the color. So you don't, I don't think you can make mistakes. I don't think you can, you can make mistakes? Okay, so you can sand it off if you make a mistake, but
So does the artist do all the preparation?
no, I think the Rory McEwen vellum is already prepared. By Rory McEwen? By his suppliers, probably. Oh, that they were his own animals. Kelmscott vellum. Yeah. And once it's gone, it's gone. Absolutely. I didn't know that bit about using the actual animals from the estate. They're not certain, but it's a great, it's a lovely idea if he did. Mm-hmm. Like in cycles, like when you might expect calves. Interesting. So, yes. Well, you surely don't lay down washes with this kind of watercolor painting. Jean can talk to it.
Jean, I'm going to give you a microphone.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Does everybody know Jean Emmons? She's a botanical
Hi. Painting on vellum, you get it. You can't get it too wet because then you ruin it because then it blisters. So you have to work really, really dry. But you can sand off whole paintings, which I have done. So it's a unique, it was supposed to be simulating painting on ivory where nothing absorbs in. So watercolor paper, depending on the sizing, you know, the paint will sink in, but on vellum it sits on top. So you have to use dry brush, very dry, very fine strokes. So. Yeah, it's not, you can't do washes, but it's kind of like just drawing, you know, very fine, you know, little strokes. It dries pretty fast. You can't work over anything wet, but it dries fast. And you do a gazillion layers, which is what he did. But what always struck me about his work is if you look at it really close up, all the little strokes look like musical notes to me, you know. Yeah, his little dots look like musical notes. Yeah, that's what I think. But that's just my. Well, they'd have little, yeah, they would. But that's just a guess on my part. So.
Anything else? We do. Well, we show Jean's, and Jean has told me, and I'll just tell, she only does 8 a year because of the amount of time. And Jean's art is in rotation in other galleries. So it is taking me a while to get some more original art. She's put some original art, and then she also does prints, glace high quality prints that she will put in our gallery in our auction. But should I be transparent? I asked her to do a show, and it's 2 years out because she's so busy. So
Well,
she didn't do them in
imagine.
6 months. Was that one in 6 months?
Well,
Because of the layers and layers.
6 hours.
Yeah, 6 hours. Sorry. Yeah, because of the layers and
those,
layers.
even the 31 hours for this is extraordinary. It's fast. Mhm. I don't think there was any gouache on vellum.
That one probably wasn't on vellum.
That one's on on paper. Um, yes. 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 So he married the granddaughter of John Jacob Astor, Romana von Hofmannsthal, she's always described as a debutante, which I just, really? She must have been, I think she must have been extraordinary to marry Rory McEwen. And they had 4 children, 3 daughters and then a son. And they lived in London, and then in 1971 they bought a place on the west coast of Scotland, and he loved being there in a much more rural environment. And from all accounts, he was a really good dad and really involved with the kids, going, hiking and fishing and whatnot. And yeah, it was a huge loss. And I think his youngest child would have been about 16 or 17 when he died. He married in 1958 and started having kids right away. But the oldest would have been 21-ish, so yeah. None of his children is a botanical artist, as far as I am aware. One of his daughters is married to a man named Jules Holland, whose job is basically like being a hullabaloo host. He's a musician and a variety show host on the BBC, and she never saw the show when she was a baby and never saw it, and only saw tapes of it long after her father's death, and she was like, "Oh my God, I married my father." Yeah. Yes. Oh, yes, the house is very much still there. I think it's still in the family. It would have probably belonged to his eldest brother and been passed as things do. Archmont House, historic landmark in Scotland. You can tour it. So it is open for tours. Which probably helps to maintain exactly. But I don't believe it belongs to the National Trust. I think it's still private.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all so much.